So what we are doing today is talking about redistricting and community map making in particular, focusing on the opportunities that people have to get engaged in the redistricting process this year. It feels like I've been talking about this for a long time. We've been talking about redistricting since the beginning of the year, really, since after the November 2020 election and the census ended and everything. And it is wild to me that the formal redistricting process is really only like 3 months away now. It's the other side of the summer. We're going to actually be seeing what the first drafts of what these maps might look like. All three of you that are on right now seem like you're pretty familiar with Ohio's districts, at least as they stand right now, but we'll do a brief overview of Ohio's districts, what Ohio's redistricting process is going to be this year. In a few months, we'll talk about some of the connections between environmental justice and districts, and how the way that we design maps can sometimes exclude or include people in the decision-making process for various environmental injustices. We'll also, and then the big thrust and most important part of this is really talking about how people like you can get involved in the redistricting process, and also thinking about how you can get other people involved too. Especially, we've got some really great opportunities this year to kind of create a really strong public record about what Ohioans want to see in their district maps. The constitutional amendments that we passed in 2015 and 2018 require public input. There has to be public hearings, and we need to take advantage of that to ensure that they have a ton of information in front of them saying what Ohioans want, so that if they ignore everything that Ohioans say, then we can in court actually say, hey, you ignored everything that Ohioans say. So that's kind of the summary of what we'll be doing. I'll move us right along. To give you a little bit of a foreshadowing of what we'll talk about a little bit more at the end of the presentation, is right now, there's an organization called the Ohio Citizens Redistricting Commission that is a grassroots independent commission made up, it's mainly sponsored by NAACP, Philip Randolph Institute, and the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, that is running a model redistricting process. There's hearings every 2 weeks throughout the summer. The first one was back in May. I didn't update this slide, obviously, but there are hearings every 2 weeks. Each of the hearings is based on different regions throughout the state. I would highly recommend checking out the work that they're doing. We'll talk a little bit more about how the community map making that we're talking about can feed into that commission. But just emphasizing that is right now, in the moment, before the State House is doing any of their formal redistricting work, there is an opportunity for Ohioans to get involved and talk about redistricting and kind of practice public testimony before this model commission, and then go to the actual State House in the fall and give the real testimony. But before we dive into the redistricting process, just to give us all a little bit of a refresher about what is wrong with our maps right now. Sometimes it's easy to just know Ohio is gerrymandered, but here's some quick reminders of what that actually looks like. So this is US District 15, which was Steve Stiver's district, but he has resigned, and there is now a special election occurring this year to replace him. And this is a really good example of a gerrymandered district in Ohio, where you have it stretching all the way from Athens County in the east, almost to Cincinnati in the west, and then up to Upper Arlington in Columbus. And it scoops into central Ohio in some really weird ways, as you can see in the map. Great example of a gerrymandered district. Not representative of communities. It's designed to place people in certain groups so that they can be represented by a particular partisan interest. Similarly, on the other side of central Ohio, we have another district that goes all the way past Zanesville, up to Mansfield, and then has a few chutes down into Columbus. Another good example of a map that's clearly designed not to represent people and place, but instead partisan interest. This one's known as the duck because it looks like a duck. And once again, somehow they thought that it made sense for a district to go from Lorain all the way almost to the Indiana border. And then finally, probably Ohio's most famous district is the Snake on the Lake, the district connected by a bridge across the bay. So, and then here's a final example of our state house districts in central Ohio, how it is once again, these districts are designed in a way to chunk groups together. They don't look compact or contiguous. They're not well-designed districts. They're clearly designed to move people in certain ways. So just that, hopefully that wasn't anything new for most of you, but Ohio has wonky districts. And we've also had an unfair redistricting process in the past. And I think many of us have probably heard the stories of the back room in 2011, where just literally in a hotel room, like 3 politicians came together with a consultant and just designed a map and gave it to the assembly to vote on, and that was our map. No public input, no real decision making from from multiple perspectives from different parties. It was just decided, and that was the map, and that was that. And so, how does that affect environmental policy? And that's and in the context for those of you that are clinicians, whether you're listening live or recorded, how does that affect how we try and pass policy that is going to impact public health? And I'm going to kick it over to Kalia for some examples.
Yeah, so it's important to talk about why an environmental organization like the OEC would work on redistricting. And in fact, it's similar to why an ecologist or why a nurse would want to advocate for fair maps and fair districts. So in order to protect our access to clean and safe water and land, we need to ensure that communities are heard, that elected officials will be making decisions on environmental policy and public health that represent their constituents fairly, and that citizens can hold their elected officials accountable for advocating for their safety. And so without this, we would just continue perpetuating environmental injustices, and I'll show you some examples of that. And we would allow environmental protection to become politically polarizing rather than the foundations of our communities and the safety of our future. So as I walk through these 2 examples, start thinking about the connections between environmental and social determinants of health and how this relates to political representation. So first off, this is an example from North Carolina. And for context, in 2016, 10 United States House of Representatives seats went to Republicans and 3 went to Democrats, similar to how we discussed earlier in introductions. Similar things happening in Ohio. But 53% of the population voted Republican and 46% voted Democrat. So why does this partisan split matter? Well, this is an example that shows how people impacted by natural hazards are excluded by the political process. So those most directly impacted by environmental injustices are represented by those who voted against protecting them from environmental harms. So North Carolina has this issue of coal ash ponds, which are depicted as black dots on these maps. And coal ash ponds are leftover ash from coal-fired plants, and it's mixed with wastewater and dumped into an open pit. And these sites exist predominantly in low-income and Black neighborhoods. So in 2014, a pipe under a coal ash pond burst, and it carried 30,000 tons of toxic wastewater drained into the river. And in 2015, House Representatives passed a bill that would actually loosen regulation on these coal ash ponds, which could lead to another disaster. So even as North Carolina residents near coal ash ponds were being told they couldn't drink their water, every Republican voted to pass this bill, and every Democrat voted against it. So the district map on the left dilutes the power of Democrat voters, mostly Black voters who lived in these neighborhoods and had the pollution from these coal ash ponds. 12 of the 14 pond sites in North Carolina were in districts represented by Republicans who were not in favor of regulation. So how does this gerrymandering seen in 2016 relate to environmental justice? Well, diluting the Black vote undermines the ability for Black voters to influence policy issues like coal ash, which disproportionately harms Black residents. So Cole, if you'll, Chris, if you'll advance on, we have another example from my hometown of Dayton, Ohio. And All on the Line produced some aggregated Ohio State House election data results that show from 2012 to 2020, Republicans got 55% of the votes, but 64% of the seats. So again, why does this matter here in Ohio? So if you look at the red stars on the map, they depict the sites of 3 Superfund sites in Dayton. And on the left, we have Superfund sites overlaid with House districts. And on the right, we have Superfund sites overlaid with racial data of the Black population of Dayton. So not only do we see disproportionate Black population surrounding these Superfund sites, but districts are splitting the communities that are in close proximity or have the potential to be affected by these sites. So every district except the Green District is Republican-led, Republican represented, and thus less likely to respond to the environmental needs of the affected communities. So communities should be represented by people who live in their communities, experience the same things. And the way that they are drawn now, it puts particular individuals in power, and it's not drawn in a way that's really representing community unity or, community needs.
Sorry, I was struggling to unclick my mute button there. Thanks, Kalia, for that great overview of those relationships. Quickly now, what we will do is just briefly go over what the redistricting process looks like for this year, because the timeline is shortening and shortening and shortening as we get closer and closer to the fall when all of this is going to go down. So we have 2 maps that we're going to be making this year. We've got the General Assembly map, and the congressional map. So for the General Assembly, we're going to have a 7-member bipartisan redistricting commission that has to have at least 3 public hearings before September 1st, 2021. Now, I will note that because the census got delayed and we likely won't get our census data until August 16th, 2021, it's likely that the General Assembly may push those hearings back a little bit and technically violate the deadlines that are in the Constitution. In my opinion, it probably makes sense for them to finalize their map a few weeks later and technically violate that timeline, but still have good data, still do the public hearing process. We'll see how that finally rolls out probably in a few months. But just noting that roughly speaking, we're going to get General Assembly maps by September 15th, 2021, but that might be pushed back a little bit. But that all will be done through the 7-member bipartisan redistricting commission, which is comprised of the governor, auditor, secretary of state, and then the heads of the 4 parties in the Senate and the House and the Ohio General Assembly. So when thinking about who the individuals with authority over these maps are, it's those 7 people. If you're thinking about who do I go talk to, who do I try and talk to about redistricting for the General Assembly, it's just those 7 people. No one else has a say in what those maps look like. Importantly, though, and this was the big kicker in the constitutional amendment that was passed in 2015, if a map doesn't have bipartisan support, the map will only last for 4 years, and the commission has to vote on a new map in 2025. Then we have the congressional map drawing process. It will occur after the General Assembly process, in theory, once again, because of the census deadlines. The timelines may get a little wonky when we get there. We don't know what that's going to look like for sure yet. But September 30th is the first deadline, and if 60% of each chamber and 50% of the minority party approves a map, then it can pass, and it'll be a 10-year map. Then if the map isn't approved with bipartisan support by September 30th, it actually gets kicked to that same 7-member commission for consideration, but that map also must have minority party approval. And then finally, if that doesn't work, November 30th is the final deadline, and a 10-year map can be approved with 1/3 support of the minority party. Otherwise, if the General Assembly just forces through a map with simple majority, then it will only be a 4-year map reconsidered in 2025. And importantly, for the context of what we're talking about here, public hearings are required prior to a vote before each deadline. There have to be public hearings before each of those deadlines, and that's really important for people like us trying to get our voice heard about what we want to see in these maps. So In addition to those rules regarding bipartisan support, there are also some rules that these maps have to follow. Some of these rules only apply to the map that gets forced through without bipartisan support. Some of them apply to all of the maps, no matter what. But this gives you an idea of some of the rules that we all voted on back in 2015 and 2018, where we've kind of spelled out that they can't have these crazy winding districts like we have now. In theory, hopefully we will see more compact and contiguous districts following boundaries that make sense. And in certain cases, especially if they force through a 4-year map, we actually have explicit bans on partisan gerrymandering. What those words actually mean will be up to the Ohio Supreme Court to decide, but hopefully it's a good interpretation. And I already mentioned the census delay, so we'll just have to keep an eye on that and how that goes. But that's the summary of the redistricting process. And as I emphasized throughout, there's all these public hearing opportunities. And that's what we're really here to talk about, is what is it that people need to be submitting to these public hearing opportunities to advocate for fair maps. And in our context, as the OEC and the Ohio Clinicians for Climate Action, we're thinking about how do we ensure that the information that's being provided to these public hearings, to these decision makers, has environmental and public health information informed in it. This is my best example that I like to throw around, is just as like an example of what would it look like if we had a district map that was built around watersheds and where people get their drinking water from. I don't think that would actually be a good map, because it wouldn't be based on people, it would be based purely on water. But it's just like a hypothetical to think about, like the different ways that we can think about how we define our maps, instead of basing it on the political parties that are in power, which is not the way that we should be making maps. So as we are moving forward now into the second part of this session, start thinking about your personal community, where you live, where you go to work, who you interact with, places you go, green spaces that you care about, all those things. Because what we're going to transition into now is kind of a tutorial on a really great tool that people can use to walk through how they can advocate for their community in this redistricting process. So I need everyone to go to districtr.org/events/open maps, and I'm actually going to put this link in the chat. What we're going to do, and I think Anna is actually going to be our guinea pig. We are going to walk through the process of using this tool called District R to create a community map that then can be used to be submitted as testimony to that Ohio Citizens Redistricting Commission that I mentioned earlier, but also in the future, it could also be used as testimony to the official public hearings that the General Assembly puts together for the redistricting process. And so this tool is really powerful. So I will briefly talk through how this tool works. So District R is a website, just a basic website that is a map designing tool that people can use to build their communities. It can also be used to build district maps, which isn't particularly relevant for what we're talking about right now. It may be relevant in the fall once we have the final census data, if you want to be one of the bold people to design an entire district map and actually submit it to the State House. But we don't have the final census data, so we can't really make those official maps in any way whatsoever yet. But if you've clicked on this link, hopefully you have by now, you will scroll down to where it says start drawing your community and click on this statewide button. And that will bring up a map of Ohio. And we'll actually switch to Anna's screen in a second, but I'm just going to walk through the various tools so you can follow along and create your own map as well. What this tool is used for is, the basic, you'll start off with a mouse that you can use to move around, zoom in on where you live. So just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to zoom in on the area of Columbus that I live in, which is close to Arlington and Grandview. And what you can do is click this paint tool up in the top right, and start painting what you define as your community, the geographic areas. So paint tool is very straightforward. You just fill in areas and it paints it. You can also add a second color if you wanted to have two different areas that are different parts of your community that have similar relationships, but you would just want to highlight them differently. And then what you can do is you can name the community. You can add places by clicking this new marker button and putting, like, I can mark the Olentangy River, that sort of thing. But the most important part of this tool is mapping out the geographic area that you define as your community, and then writing into this box a narrative about that community. And we're going to do that with Anna in a second, but I just want to make sure people understand how this tool works. Does anyone have any questions so far? If you have it up, it looks like we have someone joining right now. So a new person, so that's great.
And I'm going to say this now, and you're going to hear Chris and I say this many times by the time this is over, but please remember to submit your map. Even if you're not finished by the end of this session, just go ahead and submit it. And then, you can always edit it later. But it's really important that even if it's not perfect, even if it doesn't tell the total complete story of your community, that we do get some of this information out, because your perspective, your community story is extremely important. This is the basis of Ohio's democracy for the future. So Anna, are you ready to get started?
Ready. Can
Awesome.
you see Ohio?
I sure can. So if you want to go ahead and zoom into the approximate area of your community, we understand that, our lives exist without borders, and we travel outside of our immediate local community. I consider my community all over Columbus, just because of how I use the Olentangy River and green spaces and different parks that I don't have close access to where I, live. So Anna, how would you define your community geographically? So what are the boundaries or borders of your community?
So I would say, oh no, I clicked too much blue. How do I undo that?
There's an erase button.
Yeah. That little eraser to the right of the pen. Yep.
Okay. I'd say that's roughly my community.
Okay, great. And where it says community 1, do you want to just name your community either like Anna's community or, Richland Heights? Richmond?
Richmond, yeah.
Okay. Great. And maybe zoom in a bit if you want, and let's make some examples of important places. So can you identify some key community institutions or public services or green spaces or businesses? Just what are areas in your community that are really important and critical to your experience and how you interact with your community?
Sure. So if it's already marked, should I still mark it where the school is?
Yeah, sure thing.
Okay.
Because that's Google Maps data. So everything's on there. That doesn't actually get at the narrative of what's actually important to someone like you who lives in this community.
And then we also have a few community parks.
And would you say lots of people frequent these parks or spend time there?
So the main community park, Richmond Heights Community Park, is where the majority of the events occur. There's another community park. Where are you at? Over here, DeSan, which we utilize in conjunction with South Euclid, who's a neighboring city. That's where a lot of our intercity soccer tournaments take place.
Cool.
Oops.
And I'll just note for people who this tool can be as like comprehensive or as simple as you want. So you'll notice that Anna is naming these locations you could also go as detailed as to describe the significance of those locations. You can go as detailed as you want. You don't have to do that, but you could. If you wanted to write a novel about every place, that's an option, but not necessary.
Yeah, right.
So one of the things our community does have, we have a community medical center.
And Anna,
Which,
what's the transportation access like to this medical center? And does it serve mostly community members, or are people in the surrounding areas coming into your community to access that center?
so the majority of the people that use Richmond Medical Center are from within the area because Cleveland is so rich in hospitals. They have a lot of choice on where to go. So the majority of the people who go here are probably within a 5-mile radius because it is a community hospital as opposed to just 10 miles away from the city center of Richmond Heights is what we call Uptown Cleveland, which houses university hospitals, the Cleveland Clinic, and also Metro. So we have 3 very large health systems 10 miles away.
Great. I think that would be important to add when you're describing your community, and whether you want to just make a note to self in that box so you don't have to write it all out now. But I think that tells an interesting story about how to maybe I'm curious if that applies to other community assets. So thinking about like where most people work, or where most people get their groceries, or where they go for various appointments. Is your community pretty contained, or is it mostly just residential?
So that's a question I had. So there's a lot of food insecurity within our city. And we don't have any grocery stores within city limits. There are places that have food pantries. So the Islamic Center and also the high school, they'll rotate every other month for food pantries, and they typically get in 1,500 to 2,000 pounds of food, and it's gone within 2 hours. So people within the community and surrounding communities are very reliant on those services. So how would I mark those on the map?
So yeah, I would go ahead and can you mark on the map the Islamic Center and the other center that you mentioned that do these food pantries, and then maybe take a second to kind of jot down exactly what you just told us?
Because that's the exact type of narrative that is really important for these types of maps, that you're really emphasizing that sort of lived experience, both from a food security and health relationship that people have with their community.
And then so the high school, because the high school has it, should I mark that down and where the school is, wherever I put this school here?
Yeah, or you can just you can mark that down, or in this kind of overall description and above where it says describe this community versus describe this point, you can sort of jot down that story that involves all these different points.
Okay. I did start a narrative on another one, so I'm going to copy and paste it.
Yeah, no problem. And while she's kind of writing this down and filling out her map, if any of you have questions about the map you're drawing, or feel like you have you made an important connection and want to share a special place in your community, feel free to just unmute yourself at any time and share. But we will continue on some of these questions.
And we will have time if you don't feel comfortable with the tool to make it yourself, but you want to walk it through with us like we just did with Anna. We would also be happy to do that. We can help make your map for you too. If you are, the tool can be a little cumbersome at first.
So Anna, could you tell me a little bit about what attracts people to your community? who overall lives in your community? I know it's difficult because communities are very diverse, but can you describe your community's character at all through the people who live there?
Yes. So we're a pretty diverse community. We are roughly 50% white and 50% African American. One of the things, so I'm on our community rec board, and one of the things that we do see is a lot of people leave the community because we don't have resources that other places have. So just for instance, a city pool, ours is in disrepair because of funding. So a lot of people go to Mayfield Heights, which is a more affluent community and has, a really awesome pool. So the kids end up going there to use the pool as opposed to staying within the city and using the parks here. Same with entertainment. We have a movie theater, and those have been closed for the past year. So nobody really stays within city limits for entertainment. They go either to downtown Cleveland or other communities that do have more activities for their community members. So I'm not quite sure how I would represent those type of things on this map, unless should I do a yellow and say like all of our community members go here for fun?
Yeah, that would be a great use of like those two colors, and super interesting to like include in that description. And from that, I think we're starting to kind of parse out like what are some of the needs of your community, what are things that could be improved upon. Can you share with us, do you have a vision for your community of what it could look like in the future if some of these community needs were met?
Well, ideally, we would have a community center where people can gather. Right now, we have a Kiwanis Lodge, but it's not utilized for a lot of community activity. One of the things that has been brought up at city council meetings and to the rec board is people want a spot to gather and feel like they're part of the community. And right now, there really isn't that sense of belonging to Richmond Heights because we don't put on the programming needed, I think, or we don't have the resources available for people to want to remain in the city.
Yeah, right. And, I'm starting to kind of make connections between what you're saying and why this is important for redistricting. And something that Chris and I have seen are people that either do not want their community split when it comes time to actually draw these districts, or in what we saw when we met with Licking County Dems, possibly your community or your district could actually be drawn split in a way that makes sense, in that this side of your community goes to this town for their resources, this side of their community goes to the other town for their resources. But let me know if you agree or disagree for any reason, but I feel like it's important to know if your community does not have a strong identity or a strong boundary, it makes it difficult to decide, hey, this community should remain intact, should not be split in the redistricting process, or maybe this is a community that sort of gets carried into another district that perhaps doesn't share the same issues of food insecurity, and thus a representative wouldn't put much effort into uplifting those voices.
Yeah, I would have to think on that. So a lot of the people in the northern part of the community, so the city also borders a county line. So they end up going into Lake County more often than not for the resources, and the people on the more southern side, which is where I am, tend to stay in Cuyahoga County and go to like Highland Heights or Lyndhurst for resources because that's where the commerce is. So yeah, I'm not exactly sure if, but the people, I think it's a good mix throughout. So I don't think it should be split.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And Kathleen, I hope that conversation maybe answered a little bit of your question of why it's important to do this and for how specific the streets need to be. I wouldn't worry too much about the specificity of your boundaries because, you know, this is really complex with a lot of nuance. But if you want to just estimate an area, like this is my community, but feel free to elaborate more detail in that description box. So this is my community. However, I also travel to these places, or this is my community. However, you know, sometimes it extends over here. That way you don't have to feel like you're just committing to saying, I only utilize these spaces. You know, you can have a community and then provide additional written detail of those nuances that it's harder to illustrate with just a map.
And Kathleen, to build off of Kalia's comment there, on your question in particular as why is it important to make these maps? The key is, and City of Columbus or just Grandview, that if that's your community, that's your community. Like, and describe that. And the reason why these are important and every person's subjective community is important is the goal is to collect as many of these maps as possible so that when the information is provided to decision makers at the State House, a really strong narrative can show, hey, let's say 10 people from Grandview make a map defining their Grandview community, saying why their map is of Grandview, like this is the community of Grandview. Some people might have the Grandview community bleed into some of the outlying areas of Columbus that are around Grandview. Some may not, some people, and all these different subjective maps. The people who are collecting and analyzing these maps when they're saved and submitted are mathematicians actually from a university in Massachusetts who are aggregating all of this data and identifying trends, identifying narratives, identifying common interests, and trying to get at, okay, there's all these narratives coming out about how Grandview, Upper Arlington, and Ohio State campus have some linked community aspects. I'm just making that up. That might not happen, but let's say that does happen.
It's true in my case, Chris. My community extends throughout all those.
Yeah, exactly. So that trend is showing up. And then that information can be used as an argument to say, hey, these communities should be in a district together because they have shared interests, they have shared environmental assets, and you should not stick a line through them. This is going to be particularly important at the General Assembly level where the districts are much smaller. But at the congressional level, at the congressional district level, it's going to be really important for thinking about where are the dividing lines going to go to separate out these giant 770,000 person districts. And where that gets down to is the rules that we have for our redistricting process this year say that a certain number of counties are going to be split. You've got to follow city lines. You got to try to follow city lines, but there are going to be moments where these lines are going through communities or going around communities or going through counties. And the more data and more information we can have on the record that says, hey, people are defining their communities this way, that information is then used to support to say, hey, you should not put a line through this part of Franklin County because look at all these people who say that's putting a line straight through their community. The line should go around it to ensure that those people are represented together. And so then the final kicker on this is, let's say we provide all of this information to the State House in these public hearings. We provide these maps, we provide these narratives, and then they go ahead and make a map that's clearly partisan gerrymandered anyway. All of that information on the record showing that communities have been defined in this way, that these narratives, these public health assets, these environmental assets have defined these communities and make them connected. If all of that information is on the record and it's pretty clear that the State House just ignored it all and created a map that supported their interests, that supports any lawsuit that any organizations want to put forth to try and challenge those maps to say you ignored the process that was put in place through these constitutional amendments in 2015 and 2018. I realize that may have been a little bit longer answer than you were asking for, because I kind of tend to ramble sometimes, but I hope that answered your question.
Great, yeah. Chris, that was an excellent answer. A lot of detail, and definitely shows how passionate we are about this subject. We have about 10 minutes left, and so maybe we could do a little reflection on this as we ask our last question. So Anna, I'll start off with you, but Kathleen, Julie, anybody, feel free to also share any reflections you may have on your community in the chat box, or if you want to unmute yourself. So Anna, this is a little more hypothetical, but whether from a public health standpoint or an environmental justice standpoint in your community, I know we've talked about food insecurity a lot. What is something that you wish your representative knew about your community?
I don't know, I wish they could visit and see how welcoming the community could be to new people, and how much needed outdoor space is here that is accessible for everyone. And we do have healthcare within the city, but just better transportation on how to get there and more connectedness. So I'll put this in the comments on the website, but in our master plan for the city, one of the low-hanging fruit that was supposed to be done by 2020 was connected trailways throughout the city. So some of them have been started over 10 years ago when the plan first begun, and are now starting to fall into disrepair. And the trailways aren't fully complete, and it makes walking or riding a bike in the city I'm going to say not as pleasant, and a little dangerous. So one of the jobs I work outside of being an OCCA is at a local candy store up the street from my house. And one of the employees, because these trails weren't connected to the east side of the city, she rides on the street, and she was actually hit by a car and was in the hospital for a couple of days, like 2 weeks ago. So I guess I wish that, they could see the need for outdoor space and connected city places within the community.
Wow, that was really excellent. And I can totally imagine that being like a testimony, submitted or featured in a hearing. That was, thank you for sharing that about your community. Does anyone else want to share something similar? Yeah, Julie.
Actually, it's about the people that go from Cuyahoga County into Lake County. I just, by coincidence, the electrical vehicle, the Green Energy Ohio electrical vehicle tour around Ohio, the Lake County Transit System was featured. They have 10 electric buses and distributed en route charging, and it sounds very exciting. So that made me wonder about whether people can use public transit when they're going from Richmond Heights into Lake County to get to whatever resources. And why I see this as relevant is that the new rules, which are wonderful, are going to accentuate county boundaries more, in my estimation, that counties are going to be nested into, and there'll be some splits. So your elected official, I think you would want them to make sure that if the transit systems are by county, then they connect very seamlessly.
Mhm.
So I do know that so Lake Tran and then the RTA, there are Lake Tran stops like right by the border. So people who want to travel in from Mentor or Painesville to Cleveland, they do have direct bus routes to like one stop in the city center of Cleveland, I think from Lake Tran, but there are community points where an RTA bus will pick you up and take you on different lines at the Lake Tran stops right by the county borders.
Yeah, great. But I think that it seems to me that one big part of a healthy environment is public transportation, not only what it does to reduce air pollution, for instance, or but also it makes it's sort of like the colleague that got hit by a car when she was bicycling, and because there wasn't the links weren't there, the connections between the trail and the destination. So
Yeah.
thank you. I'm afraid I'm going to have to pop off to the LCDEMS meeting to see what they think about mapping today.
Thank you, Julie, for attending and for sharing that.
I wasn't pretending. I was
Oh,
really.
I'm sorry. I said attending.
Attending.
Yeah.
Okay. I also saw, Kathleen's. I made a map. I went to one of Carrie Koisman's on the line sessions, and I know you work closely with her. She interviewed me and did all the computer part for me. I happen to have problems using my hands. And for people like Kathleen asked about people that aren't comfortable using computers, that was an awesome experience. And it was just like the interviewing that we heard today. And so there are lots of opportunities for that, right?
Yeah. I mean, Kathleen, honestly, if you are interested in, you said you're uncomfortable with using the computers and stuff, or not good with computers. Honestly, if you want, like, Kalia or I at another time potentially, or even right now, like, we would be able to just walk through and paint for you and just ask you the questions. That's an option as well to answer your question a second time in the chat.
Bye-bye, everybody, and thanks so much.
Thanks,
Julie.
Julie.
Yeah. What Julie was connecting between the transportation and maps and county lines and how that, affects people individually, with that example of Anna's work. I think that's a perfect example of what people bring to technical maps, because if we just went about this looking at the technical maps, looking at the census data, then we would be missing so much perspective. So your story in submitting these maps or testimony, it makes your community a living place, and therefore it makes a living community map. So, drawing our community maps ensures that our experiences are centered, which will help inform these district lines. And a map without people's important landmarks and without people's narratives and the perspectives that you all have shared, about what you care about. And Anna, especially, the care that you obviously have for your community. That's what gives these maps power. And that's what gives us as citizens power to use our voice and to inform these political processes. So Chris, I don't know if you had any concluding thoughts. Again, feel free to reach out to Chris and I if you would like an additional opportunity or assistance with submitting your maps, or if you know anyone else who you think would be interested in doing this map making session. We are always happy to work with more people.
Yeah, I would want to open up the floor for Ray or Kathleen. If you did make a map and you want to share it, we would love to see it. Don't feel like you have to, but it would be fun to see if you did make a map. If not, if you're still working on it or still messing around with it, just make sure up in the top right corner, there's a button to hit save. When you are done, you can click save and submit the map, because that's the really important thing, to make sure that researchers are getting the data they need to be able to assess and make those recommendations that are needed.
So when you save it, does it automatically automatically gets sent to the right place?
When you click the save button, there should be a thing that shows up, like a prompt that shows up and walks you through the final submission options. Let me know if that prompt
Okay.
doesn't show up.
Okay, so I'm not doing it now. I'm not multitasking today. I'm just trying to listen to what you all had to say.
Makes sense.
So the issue is that the website will direct me to how to submit it, correct?
Yeah, when you click the top, when you click the save button in the top right, there will be a prompt that shows up and says, like, here's how you can submit it.
Okay. All right.
And if that doesn't work, that second link that I shared in the chat, the portal.ohio-mapping.org, that's the other submission portal.
Okay.
And Ray, I know you joined late. Where are you joining us from?
I'm from Lima, Ohio area.
Great. And are you a clinician? Are you part of the Clinicians for Climate Action group? Great.
Yeah.
What's your role?
I work in urgent care.
Great. Well,
So-
glad you were able to join us.
Yeah, I did submit a map. It wasn't exactly what you guys were talking about. Like, I pretty much just said a lot of points that are important in the community and like in the discussion part, typed out what I was doing and then just pointed them out on the map. So I hope it's helpful, and I appreciate that you guys are doing this. I like what you're saying about just having the map and then having the Congress people totally do something that's contrary to it, and how that kind of supports that they aren't paying attention to their constituents. So thanks for helping us try to make our voice heard and help our communities.
Thank you. Yeah. Don't worry about whether you had like a perfect narrative or a map or anything like that. Like, this is the thing that's like, where the goal is to get tons of different perspectives. It doesn't, not everyone needs to write an essay about like, their community. It's every single data point matters. I mean, thinking about like, getting large numbers, if you've got lots of different maps describing communities in slightly different ways, I'm going to leave it up to the mathematicians in Massachusetts to parse through what all that means. That's their job. Well, thank you, both of you, for joining us, and for the others that joined earlier and had to hop off earlier. I think that's everything. The only closing thing I will note is I mentioned the Ohio Citizens Redistricting Commission at the beginning, and that's one of the groups that's really kind of facilitating gathering these materials, and they're doing this model opportunity of talking through the redistricting process. I'm just going to drop in the chat a link to their hearing schedule. There's opportunities if you want to testify and talk about your community. You have that opportunity. You can submit your map. Your map, if you did submit it, it went to them already. So it'll be in their record. They're working with the researchers. But you could also give public testimony. There's a way to sign up and do that if you wanted to kind of practice talking about what you want to see in fair maps. You could sign up for one of those hearings, potentially give public testimony to practice for the actual public testimony in the fall, because the hope is we can get hundreds of people out to those public hearings the General Assembly has, to make them very clear that a lot of Ohioans are watching them as they make these maps. So that's my final thing. Kali or Anna, do you have anything to close?
Saul, thank you so much. And for those tuning in later from the recording, feel free to reach out to Chris and I with any questions. And thank you, Anna, for hosting us.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you guys, and thank you everyone who attended. So this will be posted on YouTube, and I will put the links from the chat in the YouTube description box so people can click on them and go to the map making or see when the hearings are.
Wonderful.
Fantastic.